Free will has been something humans have discussed for centuries. Definitions vary, but the key question at stake usually revolves around the idea of personal agency. The free agent can point to at least one action they've taken and truthfully say, I did it, and nothing made me do it. There may have been things that influenced my decision, but at the end of the day, I'm the origin or the source of at least some of my decisions. Most people throughout history have taken for granted that this sort of freedom is real, and with it comes moral responsibility. After all, it would seem that if we own our choices, we're responsible for making good ones. But atheists like Sam Harris disagree. In his 2012 book, Free Will, Sam says we'd all be better off if we stopped judging ourselves and others for making bad decisions and take what he claims is a more rational, scientific view of ourselves as merely passive observers of our conscious experiences, not active agents. The psychologist Benjamin Libet famously used EEG to show that activity in the brain's motor cortex can be detected some 300 milliseconds before a person feels they have decided to move. Another lab extended this work using functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI. Subjects were asked to press one of two buttons while watching a clock composed of a random sequence of letters appearing on a screen. They reported which letter was visible at the moment they decided to press one button or the other. The experimenters found two brain regions that contained information about which button subjects would press a full 7 to 10 seconds before the decision was consciously made. More recently, direct recordings from the cortex showed that the activity of merely 256 neurons was sufficient to predict with 80% accuracy a person's decision to move 700 milliseconds before he became aware of it. One fact now seems indisputable. Some moments before you are aware of what you will do next, a time in which you subjectively appear to have complete freedom to behave however you please, your brain has already determined what you will do. You then become conscious of this decision and believe you are in the process of making it. The first time that I read Sam's arguments and I came across studies like this, I found they were a bit intimidating. And I would go around, doing activities in my day-to-day life, and part of me would think, wow, I wonder if I'm, moving my hand now to brush my teeth because of some prior activity in my brain. Maybe I am just a robot who's just being moved around by some sort of biological stimuli that is totally out of my control. But then I came across experts as I dug into this more deeply, such as Alfred Mealy, who challenged Sam's interpretation of this data. In this video, we'll take a closer look at a few of these key brain studies. I'll break down how they were conducted, what they found, and explain why I don't think they disprove free will. Libet's main genius was a cool way to, scientists had already discovered that there was this brain activity that preceded movements. And he wanted to know, how does the time of our awareness of when we decide to move correlate to this rise in brain activity? And so he came up with a neat way to figure out when these different things were happening. He used this EEG, which measures electrical activity happening in the brain when certain regions of the brain are more active. There's more electrical activity in them that you can pick up. And then he also put these electrodes on people's wrists. He said, okay, I want you to move your wrist. Don't think about it in advance. Don't plan it out. I just want spontaneous movements. And during the course of the experiments, they moved their wrist like 40 times per, experiment. And while they're moving their wrist, he's taking readings of, okay, when does the actual muscle movement happen? That's one data point he wants to know. Then he wants to know, when does this brain activity begin? That's another data point. And thirdly, when do people become aware of their intent to move or feeling an urge to move? When does that happen? When are they aware of that? And to measure when they're aware of the intent or urge to move, he uses this fancy a Libet clock here, where there's like a dot spinning around this clock, And so participants, as they're there, all rigged up in their fancy EEG gear, they're watching the dot spin around this clock, and then they note the position of where this dot is on this clock the moment that they become aware of their intent to flex their wrist. The brain activity he found was something like this. Here at time 0, this is when the electrodes on people's wrists are actually picking up the movement itself. So about 200 milliseconds before that, that's when people became aware of the urge to move. And then about half a second before that, 550 milliseconds, that's when this rise in brain activity seemed to occur. But what Alfred and other scientists and philosophers have rightly asked is, well, how do we really know that the start of this rise in brain activity represents when the decision actually takes place, that this is your brain deciding to move your muscle? Like maybe this is just the brain gearing up to prepare to make any decision, but then like a president receiving advice from his advisors, we still make the executive decision here consciously of whether or not we are going to follow through with that intention and actually make the choice. Now, over the 40 years since Libet's study, there's been a lot of follow-ups done on to figure out what exactly is this mysterious readiness potential. Here's a few examples of key findings from these studies. There was one study that showed that when subjects intended to or prepared to move but didn't actually move, the readiness potential still appeared and was actually still the same size and magnitude, even though there was no follow-through movement. I found that really interesting. Libet thought that what was happening was that people were actually gearing up in order to move, but then canceling the movement. And Mealy interprets it a bit different and just says, no, I think they're intending to prepare to move, but they're not actually intending to move, if that makes sense. Another example is that there was some scientists who noticed, okay, if we go back to this drawing, this is kind of an average of data from a whole bunch of different study participants who would have taken part in Libet kind of studies. In their individual reports, they didn't all exactly feel that awareness of the urge to move at exactly 200 milliseconds prior to the action. Some of them felt that awareness a little bit closer to the action itself, and some of them felt it a little bit farther. So what these researchers wanted to know is when we look at the variation of that awareness, does that variation sync up with when this start of this rise in brain activity happens? Because they reasoned if this intention, if the feeling of okay, I want to choose now is actually being caused by this brain activity, then you would think that the start of this activity would fluctuate in a way that syncs up with the timing of that urge or awareness. And what they found was that this variation didn't actually sync up with when the readiness potential started. The readiness potential always seemed to happen, I think, at around the same time prior to the action, regardless of whether people's feeling of, I chose to do it was a little bit earlier or a little bit later. Another reason why scientists started to think that the readiness potential was not really the decision was that what they found, they wanted to know what's the fastest from the cue or the intent for people to move to when they could actually flex their wrist. The setup was, okay, we want you to flex your wrist as soon as you hear this audio cue. And they found that on average, it was around 230 milliseconds. When you consider that there's probably some lag in response time of okay, we have to register, we're hearing the cue, and it's probably even a bit faster than 230 milliseconds. If you recall, it was about 200 milliseconds prior in Libet's experiments where people became aware of urge to move or whatnot. What this study showed was that people can indeed make decisions in a time frame that lines up with that sort of awareness. And if people can make decisions in that quick time frame, it doesn't take half a second to make a decision. So it adds weight to the idea that whatever's happening half a second prior to the movement isn't necessarily the decision itself, but just something leading up to it. Another interesting study, they asked the question, okay, in this original instance, it looks like a pretty clear like up ramp of this brain activity, the readiness potential leading to the action. But when you look at individual reports, there seems to be this like fluctuating noise in the brain all the time at a low level. What these scientists were able to show using a computer model is that when you take a bunch of individual reports of like when people follow through with this unconscious urge to move their wrist, and then average them together, you get what looks like this smooth ramp up to the point where they actually move. But they argued that could just be a function of averaging together this fluctuating pattern of noise. So they were questioning, okay, is this readiness potential really this cause and effect relationship that we've been thinking that it is? Or could it just be more of a random variation of background static in the brain? Okay, but what about those other studies Sam mentioned where scientists could predict things in advance? In newer studies, we do see some link between unconscious brain activity and decisions. Haynes and Soon in 2008, they used functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, which is a way of measuring blood flow in parts of the brain. In this study, participants were asked to make many simple decisions by pressing one of two buttons. There was no penalty for pressing one. There's no reason really to do one or the other. And what they found was there was information related to which choice a person would make that appeared up to 10 seconds, 7 to 10 seconds before they were aware of what they were going to choose. However, it's important to note that the accuracy was on average around 60%, which is only slightly better than chance, which would be 50%. These are 50-50 choices. In another study, instead of electrodes over the top of the scalp, these were actually surgically implanted inside the brain. Participants were asked to press a key on a keyboard whenever they wanted, and then make a report after they pressed it. And the report was similar to Libet's study where the hand was on a clock when they first felt the urge to press a key. Now, the 80% refers, you remember in Sam's argument, he says, okay, 80% of the time scientists could predict something about the choice. What the 80% refers to is that, okay, at time zero, this is when those electrodes are capturing that, okay, the action is taking place at time zero. So about 700 milliseconds prior to the action, there's this brain activity that's detected. The participants are making a report later on of what time that they felt this intention to then make that action, or they felt like an urge to press the key. 80% of the time, scientists could guess based on this brain activity, like, okay, we think that what the time that is being reported, that time is going to be, let's say that G here represents the guess. And then later we hear from the participants of like when they actually reported the time. I'll call that A, the actual reporting of when they felt that intention to move. And 80% of the time, what the scientists predicted and what the report actually was more or less the same within a couple hundred milliseconds. Does this disprove free will? Well, many neuroscientists and philosophers don't think so, and here's why. It still doesn't prove that the start of that brain activity is actually when the decision is being made. It could simply be that there is an unconscious urge being produced by brain activity, but then we are deciding whether or not to go along with this urge. Alfred talks about this in his book where he describes his experience taking part in a Libet study was helpful in understanding this nuance. So here he says, recall that Libet generalized from his findings in this unusual setting to all intentional actions. He suggests that what he thought he discovered here applies to all actions. A comment on my own experience as a subject in the Libet-style experiment will help you see the problem with his assumption. At first, I waited for conscious urges to flex, to pop up in me so I'd have something to report when it was time to make the consciousness report. I waited until I was pretty sure the urges weren't just going to pop up on their own. I wondered what to do, and I hit on a strategy. I decided that I would just say now to myself silently, flex my wrist in response to the silently uttered cue, and then a little while later try to report where the hand was on the Libet clock when I said now. If you were to ask me why I said now when I did, I'd have to say, I don't know. Why might that be? In Libet's experiment, there's no special reason to pick any particular moment to begin flexing. I had no reason to prefer any given moment for saying now over any nearby moment. And I was following my instructions as any good experimental subject would. That is, I was trying to be spontaneous, and I avoided thinking about when to flex or when to say now. I think it could very well be that in a situation like this, where you're kind of drifting along and going with the flow in an experiment, that maybe you are being influenced by unconscious urges, not in the sense of being forced to do something by them, but in the sense of the president is not resisting what his advisors are telling him because he has no reason to do so. But in regular life, we often face, much more meaningful decisions where we weigh pros and cons, like, if we're going to move or get married or even pick what flavor of ice cream we're going to have amongst some great options. And it's really interesting to see that there was a newer study done in 2019 that showed different results. In this study, what they did was they compared giving people arbitrary choices where they said, okay, pick between these two options, but in either case, it involved charities. And in either case, no matter what option people picked, both charities would get $500. And so they compared that with a meaningful choice where depending on what charity was picked, it would mean that that charity got the full $1,000, people were told. And what they found was fascinating, which is that when they gave people meaningful choices, there was virtually no readiness potential that appeared, versus when they gave people arbitrary choices, there was this, brain activity that preceded that kind of decision. So in conclusion, atheists like Harris argue that neuroscience proves that free will is an illusion because we see brain activity that starts before we're aware of deciding to do something. The reasoning goes like this, which is that, number one, participants in certain studies make decisions unconsciously, not consciously. Number two, that therefore all our decisions are actually made unconsciously. Number three, a decision isn't free unless it's conscious. And number four, therefore free will is an illusion. But as we've seen in this video, when we take a closer look at the evidence that is supposed to back up these premises, there's a lot of cracks in this argument, I'd say. It's true that classic experiments find that there are some unconscious brain signals before simple actions, and that in some cases these signals have some correlation with simple decisions, but our best evidence seems to point in the direction of this early brain activity being preparation or even just random noise and not the decision itself. We saw that the predictive power of the signals is weak, and it's often only slightly better than chance. And that these studies study trivial, no-stakes choices where you might just go with the flow. When you give people meaningful choices, the readiness potential disappears. So premises 1 and 2 aren't very well supported, and it seems science doesn't close the door on free will. And various experts agree with this. I'll read a few quotes to you. Finally, in light of the problems with the three premises, we can safely conclude that the conclusion of Libet's arguments rests on very shaky ground. Libet's experiments come nowhere close to proving that we never act of our own free will. And later he, after reviewing newer studies, he says the main problems with Libet's version of the argument apply here as well. There was also another source I found helpful, which was Christy L.S. Cooper, who is a neuroscientist and an educator. She says, we've been working on this. Scientists have been working on this Libet stuff and the question of neuroscience and free will for the last 40 years. We know a lot more about the readiness potential, but don't seem any closer to agreeing as to the significance of many aspects of the original findings. And this is significant and important considering that at the popular level, non-neuroscientists use Libet's studies to support a deterministic view of the mind. Indeed, although most neuroscientists, the vast majority of neuroscientists, believe in a deterministic view of free will, many of them do not believe that Libet's experiment can be shown to do away with free will. But this paper says things like, we're still in the Wild West here of neuroscience and the brain, and there's a lack of solid, unitary, and coherent methodological framework as to how to connect neurophysiology and agency. It frequently happens that tentative approaches, bold but very preliminary claims, and even clearly flawed interpretations of experimental data are taken for granted. The general upshot is that very much still has to be clarified as to what and how neurosciences can tell us about human agency, and that in the meantime, intellectual and methodological caution is to be recommended. Now, I want to throw back to part of Sam's argument at the beginning that I mentioned of this video, is that we should discard free will because it'll make us less judgmental. I disagree with this. Even if we believe in freedom and moral responsibility, I think we can still choose to forgive. We can still choose to be kind to ourselves and to other people. And as my friend Chris pointed out, I think this kind of grace is beautiful because it's costly, because it still calls evil, but responds with love anyways. We saw that recently in a touching example of Erica Kirk when she got up on stage and forgave the man who shot her husband. She still was able to say, despite the weight and the gravity of this, I still am going to extend love and forgiveness and empathy to you, even though, this is such a scarring, meaningful, brutal thing. Anyway, what do you think? Regardless of whether or not you agree with me, please leave me a comment and let me know your thoughts. I'm very open to talking about this stuff, and I won't take offense if you disagree with me or challenge my views, so drop me a comment and let me know what you think. In our next video, we're going to be diving more into the philosophy of the human person and thinking about the soul and thinking about whether or not we're just physical or whether there's an immaterial aspect to us. So hit that subscribe button and I'll see you in the next video.